There was a man who didn't believe in God. He wasn't confused about it. He wasn't undecided. He had made up his mind. There is no God. He had heard Christians talk about Jesus. He had heard people pray. He had heard people say that God answers prayers, that God performs miracles, that God changes lives. But he wasn't interested. He believed faith was something people used because they couldn't handle life without something to believe in. He trusted what he could see, what he could touch, and what he could measure. And whenever someone talked to him about God, he had the same response: show me. Show me that God exists. Show me a miracle. Show me something I can prove. And perhaps you met someone like that. Maybe you wonder about them. How can someone look at the world and not believe in God? How can someone hear about Jesus and simply reject him? How can someone hear the gospel and walk away? But then Jesus tells us a story, and suddenly this isn't just a story about an atheist, it's a story about soil. Jesus said that a sower went out to sow. Some seed fell along the path, some fell on rocky ground, some fell among thorns, and some fell on good soil. And Jesus says something that should make every one of us stop and examine ourselves. He who has ears to hear, let them hear. Notice what Jesus didn't say. He didn't say, he who has ears to hear, let him judge the other soil. He said, let him hear. Because the question isn't simply what kind of soil is that person. The question is, what kind of soil am I? And perhaps an even more important question is, what happened to your soil? Think about the atheist. What happened to his soil? Maybe it had become hard. Maybe pride hardened it. Maybe disappointment hardened it. Maybe intellectual questions hardened it. Maybe someone had hurt him in the in the name of religion. Maybe he had watched people who claimed to follow God behave in ways that made him want nothing to do with God. Or maybe he has simply spent years telling himself there is no God. And the more he said it, the harder the soil became. But here's something interesting about hard soil. Hard soil isn't necessarily dead soil. It may simply be soil that had been walked on for a very long time. If you ever walk through a field, you know something about paths. They become hard because people keep walking over them, one step, then another, until the ground that once could receive seed becomes packed down. And sometimes that's what happens to a human heart. Life walks over it, disappointment walks over it, pain walks over it, unanswered prayers walk over it, betrayal walks over it, fear walks over it, and eventually the heart says, I'm not letting anything in anymore. I think about my older sister. She lived in a wheelchair for half of her life because of cancer. One day she was invited to an event where people were talking about a man who was performing miracles. People who couldn't walk were reportedly walking. People who had suffered were being healed. And my sister refused to go. Why? Not because she didn't understand what they were saying, not necessarily because she hated God. She was afraid. She was afraid that if she went there believing something might happen and nothing happened, she would have to carry home something more painful than the wheelchair disappointment. So she protected herself. She didn't go. And that story has stayed with me because sometimes we think the hardest hearts belong to people who say, I don't believe. But sometimes the hardest heart belongs to someone who quietly says, I can't afford to believe anymore. I can't afford. I can't afford to believe anymore. Those are not the same thing. One may be rebellion, the other may be self protection. One says, I don't want God. The other says, I want God too much to risk being disappointed again. And perhaps that's you. Maybe you built walls around your heart, not because you don't care, but because you care deeply. You pray once, you hoped once, you trusted once, and God didn't intervene the way you expected. So you learn something. You learn not to hope so much. You learn not to expect so much. You learn to protect yourself. And eventually you said, whatever happens, happens. But perhaps you didn't realize what happened to your soil. It became hard. Not because you stopped needing God, but because you were afraid to need Him again. Then Jesus tells us about another kind of soil, the rocky ground. The seed springs up quickly. There is excitement, there is emotion, there is enthusiasm, but there is no depth. And when trouble comes, the plant withers. Have you ever seen someone become passionate about God when everything is going well? Then they pray, they worship, they talk about Jesus, they say, God is so good. And then something happens. The diagnosis comes, the relationship ends, the job disappears, the prayer isn't answered, the person dies, and suddenly they ask, where is God? The sun gets hot and the shallow roots can't survive. Jesus wasn't promising us a life without storms. He was warning us that shallow roots cannot sustain deep faith. Faith cannot live forever on emotions. Eventually, you have to put roots down. Then there is the soil among the thorns. The seed grows, but so do the weeds. And eventually, the weeds choke the life out of it. Jesus says the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, and the desire for other things can choke the word. The soil is interesting. The problem isn't that nothing is growing, too much is growing. There are too many voices, too many distractions, too many ambitions, too many desires, too much noise. God isn't necessarily being rejected. He is simply being crowded out. And it is and isn't that possible even for people who love God? We can be so busy living that we stop listening. So occupied that we stop praying. So distracted that we stop hearing. The seed is there, but so are the thorns. And then Jesus tells us about the good soil. The seed falls into good ground, it takes root, it grows, it produces fruit. But notice something. The good soil wasn't good because it had never experienced storms. It was good because it received the seed. That's important because maybe you're listening to this thinking, my heart is in good soil. I failed too many times, but Jesus isn't asking you to manufacture perfect soil. He's asking you to receive the seed. Receive it. Not now let's go back to the man who said there was no God. One night he was alone, and for the first time a question entered his mind. What if you're wrong? He tried to push it away, but the question returned. What if you're wrong? And for the first time, he stopped arguing. He started searching. He opened the Bible. He began reading. He didn't have all the answers. He still had questions. But something had changed. For years, he said, God, prove yourself. Now he was saying, God, if you're there, I'm willing to know you. And that was the beginning, not certainty, not a miracle, not an emotional experience, willingly, willingness. His soil was beginning to soften. And then he encountered Jesus, not the Jesus he had mocked, not the Jesus represented by imperfect people, but Jesus himself. He read about the way Jesus treated the broken, the rejected, the sinful, the sick, and the grieving. He read about the cross, and eventually he came to a place where he could no longer simply dismiss Jesus. He has started his journey saying, there is no God. Then he says, I don't know. Then I want to know. And finally, Jesus, I believe. Now, here's the part I don't want you to miss. The atheist thought his biggest problem was whether God existed. But perhaps his deeper problem was that he had never examined his soil. And perhaps that's true for some of us. We spend so much time asking, why doesn't God speak? That we never ask, am I listening? We ask, why doesn't God answer? But never ask, what have I done with the answers he has already given me? We ask, why doesn't God change my circumstances? But never ask, what is God trying to change in me? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all is, what happened to your soil? Was it hardened by disappointment? Was it hardened by suffering? Was it hardened by unanswered prayer? Was it hardened by pride? Was it hardened by sin? Was it hardened because someone hurt you? Did you once had a tender heart towards God and somewhere along the way stop expecting Him? Did you once pray with faith and now only pray out of habit? Did you once believe God could do anything and now you've quietly decided what God can do? What happened to your soil? And here's the good news. The sower hasn't stopped sowing. Jesus is still speaking. The seed is still being scattered. The invitation is still being given. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. You may have hard soil, but can God can soften hard soil. You may have rocky soil, but God can deepen your roots. You may have a thorny soil, but God can remove what is choking your faith. And you may think you've gone too far. You haven't, because the sower is still sowing. Maybe you spend years saying there is no God. Today, perhaps you don't have to say, I believe. Maybe your first step is simply, God, I'm willing to listen. Maybe that's where your journey begins. Maybe you've been afraid to hope because you've been disappointed before. Then tell God that. Tell him that. Don't hide it. Say, God, I'm afraid to hope again. Maybe you've been angry with him. Tell him. Maybe you have questions. Ask, ask them. Maybe you don't understand why he allows something to happen. Tell him. God is not threatened by an honest heart, but don't close the door before you give him the opportunity to answer. Because perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't that someone doubts God. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is when someone becomes so afraid of disappointment that they no longer allow themselves to hear him. The sea is still falling. The sower is still walking through the field, and perhaps today the sea is falling on your heart. So before you ask what kind of soil is everyone else, stop, be still, and ask the question Jesus may be placing before you today. What happened to your soil? What happened to the heart that once hoped? What happened to the heart that once prayed? What happened to the heart that once believed? And perhaps more importantly, is there still enough of that heart left to say, Jesus, speak, I am listening? Because the story doesn't have to end with hard ground. It doesn't have to end with disappointment. It doesn't have to end with unbelief. The sower, the sower is still sowing, the sea is still alive, and the invitation is still standing. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So hear, let the seed fall. Let God deal with the soil. And perhaps the heart you thought was too hard was simply a heart that had been waiting a long time for rain. And maybe Jesus is sending the rain.